Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a licensed mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We are thrilled to announce our Summer 2025 NARM Therapist Training offering, designed to equip you with the transformative power of the neuroaffective relational model. The summer online cohort for the NARM Therapist Training runs from May to December 2025. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, and CPTSD. You'll gain specialized trauma-informed training that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. Join us and experience the integration of the neurobiologically informed clinical approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Become part of a community where mindfulness meets clinical expertise and embody professional and personal growth with a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Visit ComplexTraumaTrainingCenter.com to register for the Summer 2025 NARM Therapist Training. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. And now for our interview. Dr. David H. Rosmarin is the director of the Spirituality and Mental Health Program at McLean Hospital and an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Bowling Green State University, and he completed a predoctoral internship and a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital. Dr. Rosmarin studies the relevance of spirituality to mental health, and he innovates methods for clinicians to address this area of life. He has published over 100 manuscripts, editorials, and chapters, and served as co-editor of the Handbook of Spirituality, Religion, and Mental Health. Dr. Rosmarin's work is regularly featured by the media and has appeared on CNN, NPR, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. David H. Rosmarin. All right. Welcome, David. Thanks for joining us here on Transforming Trauma.
Thanks for having me.
As I was preparing for our conversation today, I was struck by so many things in your work that I'm looking forward to learning more about. So I'm going to take a moment to kind of relax my internal pace a little bit slower because I don't want to rush through this. But we'll have time to get into some of what I'm feeling really excited about. But first, I'd really love to hear, what would you want listeners to get out of our conversation today?
That's interesting. I think there's so many important aspects of the work that clinicians do today that, that your listeners are doing to help people struggling with aspects of mental health. I think you wanted to speak about spirituality and mental health, which is a real focus of my academic work within McLean Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. So happy to start there and see where things go.
Cool. Great. First, could you tell us a little bit more about who you are and your work generally in case the listener isn't familiar?
Yeah, David H. Rosmarin. So I'm an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and I've been a clinical psychologist at McLean Hospital for the last 15 years. I also have a private clinic called Center for Anxiety, centerforanxiety.org. And we have offices in the Boston area and also in New York, servicing about 800 or 1,000 or so individual clients per year. So that is, between the two of them, definitely a busy week.
Mm-hmm. And what led you to the work that you're doing?
I think a lot of things, we see research as research, and, anxiety has definitely been a part of my life. And I think spirituality has been part of how I've dealt with that. Mm-hmm. And when I started taking even Psychology 101, Abnormal Psychology, and Personality Psych, and all the other, undergraduate courses, I was really struck by the absence of discussions about a spiritual and religious life. And it really didn't jive with my own personal experience. To me, it was quite a core piece, not only of my own identity, just as a human, but also in dealing with anxiety, sadness, relationships, connection, anger, whatever it is, irritability, all the sort of human emotions that I and everyone else had experiences with by virtue of being human. And from there, I really looked for professional opportunities to develop a line of psychological science inquiry about spirituality and mental health. One thing led to the next, and it's been, here I am mid-career doing the same thing.
And then can you tell us a little bit specifically, I mean, I'm curious about the history, but then also kind of the basic tenets or concept of the connection paradigm.
Yeah, so connections is something that I started writing about a little while back, but I think it really came from understanding that spirituality and religion are typically something that we ignore in mental health. When I give continuing education seminars, I'll ask for a raise of hands of how many people have had a single hour of training in how to address spiritual and religious life. And if 5% of the audience has raised their hands, then that's a lot. Usually it's 2 or 3 people in an audience of several hundred. And to me, that's really unfortunate and actually does our clients and us a disservice, because there's a huge disparity between professionals and academicians in terms of spiritual and religious life and that of patients and clients who are coming in for services and in the general population. If you just look at the data, more than 90% of Americans anyway have at least some belief in a higher power or something greater, and more than 50% are praying or even going to services on a weekly basis. So, these are often central aspects. In our work here at McLean Hospital, we found that more than 80% of our patients are using religion and spirituality to cope with their distress. That's in Eastern Massachusetts, right? This is not the Bible Belt by any stretch. So to me, it's a real shame that we ignore this, and I think we need more science on it, more clinical innovation and more writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. And I know that for myself coming into the field, I know that's something that I've really, craved more of and what drew me to the NARM model. But the transpersonal piece, what you're naming, the spiritual element that is often really neglected and not talked about.
Sure.
Yeah. So I know a little bit about the connections paradigm. I know that there's some basic concepts, the different spheres of a relationship. Can you talk a little bit about the 3 different spheres?
Sure. This is really something that was born out of, my own faith tradition, being the Jewish faith and my exposure to it. I think that, when dealing with clients of all groups, there are different sort of ways to approach matters of spiritual and religious life. This is a particularly broad one. I think it does apply very broadly and, across certain conditions and people irrespective of their faith. And the basic idea is that people have the opportunity in this world for connection with ourselves, connection with others, and then some sort of spiritual connection, whatever that might be. And to the extent that we are connected and have these relationships, we tend to thrive. That model and that way of thinking about things has certainly shaped, my approach to psychotherapy and to research. To what extent do we accept ourselves and also push ourselves towards resilience and see that struggle as a connecting process? And also, to what extent do we resolve our conflicts with others and also seek to have spiritual connection? Often these are things that they're more in the realm of coaching than clinical work. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I think a lot of our clients in clinical realm seek connection. So that's some high level thoughts about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you talked about the sphere of relationship with ourselves. And from what I understand, we're talking about the body and the soul. And can you kind of speak a little bit to the details of those 3 different spheres?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I came to McLean Hospital 15 years ago, a lot of patients wanted to speak about spiritual and religious life with me by virtue of the fact that I'm of the Orthodox Jewish faith and, walking around the clinical units with the yarmulke. And after that happened so many times, I realized the importance of studying this and developing ways to speak with our patients about that. And that's really been my journey here at McLean for the last 15 years. Done quite a bit of scientific work on it and training clinicians to address this as opposed to shying away from it.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about how you train clinicians to address this and what that looks like?
So there are opportunities within the CE world to do continuing education training. There's also at McLean Hospital, we have a number of training programs, and I'm, very fortunate to be on faculty for those and to train our staff here. But really, most of all, I think helping clinicians to not shy away from this topic. Often people say it's a type of area of life that you have to check at the threshold of the therapy room. And I don't think that does our patients a service. I think it's the opposite. So really getting over that fear and scaffolding for clinicians rather, what they should and can say to patients. For example, I train our clinicians to assess for positive and negative aspects of spiritual life. And like any area of our existence, there are resources and then there are stressors or difficulties. And spirituality is a domain that really can have both. And once we understand the psychological relevance of this domain, it's really like assessing for anything else. So destigmatizing it is a big part of what I try to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting because I feel like I've heard in the media and in the news that it seems like a lot of Americans, at least, are maybe stepping away from organized religion. But I found it really interesting when I've had clients who maybe didn't grow up religious, but they're starting to have some curiosity around what that would be or even what spirituality would be.
Sure.
And sometimes they'll say, is it okay if we talk about this? I'm like, absolutely. It seems like it's an important piece. So I wonder what your experience with that is.
Yeah, I like your anecdote there that clients are often even hesitant to bring it up. They don't realize that psychotherapy is a safe space to talk about spiritual matters. That to me is pretty tragic. I mean, I think people often see the therapist as someone who they can speak about anything with except for God, or anything with except for their faith, except for their faith community. And the bifurcation of psychotherapy and spirituality over the past 100 years, more than 100 years, starting with Sigmund Freud, has not served our field well in terms of outreach, in terms of dissemination, and certainly not in terms of clinical practice, I believe.
Yeah. So you mentioned your own personal experience and growing up in the Jewish faith tradition, that it's been an important part for you. And I'm curious how you, in all of your training, did you find ways to kind of weave this in initially, or was this kind of part of your process? Did it take time?
Oh, I mean, it's taken a fortune of time and I'm still very much in it. One of the developments we came up with here at McLean was a program called SPIRIT, which is an acronym for Spiritual Psychotherapy for Inpatient, Residential, and Intensive Treatment, SPIRIT. Lucky acronym. And this is a acute psychiatric psychotherapy intervention, which helps clinicians to address the positive and negative aspects of spirituality with patients in as low as 20 to 30 minutes in a group setting in psychiatric programs. And we've had more than 5,000 patients who have gone through our SPIRIT training, I should say SPIRIT psychotherapy, and about 36 clinicians have gone through the training in order to be able to do it. Cross-diagnostic, so we've been able to launch this with patients, whether they have psychotic disorders or mood and anxiety disorders, or whether they're grappling with substance and alcohol misuse, trauma, really irrespective of that. And it's been extremely well received. And published a number of papers on it, on SPIRIT. So it's been a great sort of ride, and I think a good proof of concept that it's really not rocket science to address spiritual life as long as you have the right questions to ask and you're willing to do so.
Yeah. Part of my training has really been about like this curiosity piece and having a genuine curiosity. And again, when I have a client who shares that they're wanting to kind of explore this, if I can sort of get myself into that curious place of, okay, well, what is important in this realm for you? Like, what about, leaning into this spiritual side of your life would benefit you? It sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And we've had a lot of patients who sign up for the SPIRIT therapy group who do not have a religious background and who are, like you said, just simply as curious as you are in exploring this area as something that could be relevant. If you think about it, some of the main functions of spirituality from a psychological perspective, giving meaning, giving hope, giving a sense of purpose, giving a sense of connection, whether it's a spiritual connection or a connection to a community. Those don't sound like such bad ingredients in strengthening our clients who are grappling with anxiety, depression, or any diagnosis for that matter. It's something just human beings need.
Yeah. And I know, just considering like how a lot of the distress that our clients come to us with often is like, there's a root piece around like a disconnection from themselves. And so if they can't feel connected to themselves, they'll feel disconnected from, the people in their lives that they care about and disconnected from a higher power, God. And so I'm curious for you in the concepts of the connections paradigm, human search for connection. How do you address that? Or like, how do you come to that?
I think all psychotherapy addresses it in some way, where we help people to become more accepting of themselves, maybe to push beyond their limits and to accept the struggle associated with that, to connect more with others, and also to connect directly between a client and a therapist. There's a human connection there. But what often is missing is that third dimension of connecting with something spiritual, looking at the greater meaning, the why me, why is this happening? You see a little bit of it happening in the moral injury work, but there's not a lot. And often patients or clients are coming in with those questions. real existential big questions. What's the meaning in this? Is there someone out there? Am I alone in the world? Is there a purpose to my life? And either struggling with that or thriving with it, or both. Sometimes I'm feeling connected to something greater and seeing that as a resource. But like I said, since the dawn of psychotherapy, we've just shied away from these basic discussions, and it's a real shame. It's not to our advantage or our clients.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk a little bit about like the opposite of cancer is being in remission. It's not necessarily thriving. I know I've had clients come in and they're like, I don't really know why I'm here. I'm not thriving. There's nothing terrible happening. I don't think I have a whole lot of trauma necessarily, but I'm not thriving and I don't know what that is. And oftentimes when we kind of drill down to it, it is often that disconnection piece. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious how you hold that and how you bring the work that you're doing.
I think you're making a really great point, which is that sometimes the presenting problem is a little amorphous, and sometimes orienting people to what's most important in their life, what gives them the most meaning, what gives them the most sense of connection, and talking about spirituality can really orient them and get them more focused. Some of the work that's being done in psilocybin is actually suggesting this, I believe, in some ways, where a lot of individuals seemingly irretractable depression, treatment refractory cases, people dealing with mood disorders for 10, 20, 30 years, who having what they will describe as a spiritual experience, even one or two of these, whether it's also psilocybin or MDMA, and other of these types of experiences, are actually more open to something greater, which then helps them to focus. So I think the jury's out on those interventions, and there's still a lot to be developed. But the main point, I think, is true.
What you said just made me think of something. I was in a training and someone had said something to the effect of like, when I feel this deep connection with myself, with, maybe a higher power, with other people, it almost feels like a psychedelic. It can feel so intense in a beautiful way. And I do wonder if psychedelics, it's another offering, I don't know, an excuse. I don't know if that's the right word, but we can point to it. Like, this is what connection feels like. But anyway, I appreciate you naming that.
It could be. I mean, I think, it's still very early days. We're not even at the point of FDA approval for these. And also what's going to have to happen, I believe, is usable, replicable psychotherapy interventions, which are given alongside ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, and the like, because it's not only a pharmacological agent, there's also a psychosocial process that has to be guided. And we're seeing that some people, have a bad experience on these, and it can be iatrogenic. So it has to be harnessed in the right way. And I think that's the truth about spirituality as well. Some people struggle with their spiritual life. Like I said before, why me? Why is God doing this to me? Why am I being punished? Feeling alienated, feeling like just yesterday I had a multi-day workshop based on my new book, Thriving with Anxiety. And one of the participants was sharing with me, something that she felt she had done in her life, and really feeling, I think it's 20 years later, an incredible amount of guilt about that, and actually said, I feel cursed for something that she had done 20 years ago. Yeah. So that's never been addressed by any psychotherapist that she's had, ever. Wow. They don't want to go there. That's a shame. To me, that's a shame.
Yeah.
I think it's a domain of life like anything else, and we have to be able to, to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what a burden to carry for 20 something years.
Yeah. Incredible.
Yeah. That was kind of a nice segue. You mentioned your book and anxiety, and I imagine that grew out organically of the work that you were doing before, but can you share with us more about your work with anxiety?
Sure. I think that we've taken a very biomedical approach as a society to anxiety, and trying to get rid of it, seeing it as a disease, seeing it as something that we cannot tolerate and thrive with. And I think it's done a disservice. That's actually created more of an anxiety epidemic, where we interpret low levels of anxiety as a failing, and that makes us more anxious. Right? Anxiety in of itself becomes a trigger. So I believe we have to reinterpret this ubiquitous emotion that all human beings have as part of the puzzle, part of the fabric of human emotional landscape, and understand that it's something that we can actually use to thrive in a constructive way when we have the tools to be able to do so.
So in your book, and remind me the title of the book.
Thriving with Anxiety, 9 Tools to Make Your Anxiety Work for You.
Okay, great. Can you share with us a few of the tools or kind of what feels most important in this moment?
I think anxiety can help us to develop resilience. Often when people are feeling anxious and then they mount the opportunity, in exposure therapy, we do that clinically, where we actually harness anxiety as a way of developing more emotional fortitude. The clients that I've seen, certainly when we've seen it in my program, Center for Anxiety, have come out more resilient in general in their lives, not only in their specific area of anxiety. So I think that's, tremendously, in some ways, beneficial, really using anxiety as a way of moving forward as opposed to something that's holding you back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a different way of relating than I think probably most of our society, at least in Western culture, how we relate to anxiety. To hold it in a way of like, this is actually something that could help propel you forward is
right.
Maybe
Correct.
A different way of holding it. Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, more just about do you have any personal experiences or even clinical experiences that you could share with our listeners in any of these realms that we've explored?
How about we, talk a little about the interpersonal realm? I think that sometimes we look at anxiety as something that gets in the way of relationships, and it often does. But at the same time, human beings really need to be vulnerable in order to connect at a deep level with each other, right? It's usually the people who need you the most and who you need the most who you can really connect with. And emotional needs are part of that, right? If I can cry on someone's shoulder, then I'm, obviously that relationship's at a deep level. And I think vice versa, right? When I can be there, we see this in clinical practice. I think often our clients who rely on us the most, we feel the closest to, and in our personal lives as well, right? That emotional depth is a function in many ways, therefore, of anxiety. When we can allow ourselves to experience that anxiety, it opens us up to trust and to connection in new ways. So while it can get in the way, it can also be a catalyst to greater connection when we utilize it and lean into it as opposed to trying to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, clinically, like how do you, I guess, encourage or invite clients or patients to lean into it?
By acknowledging, I'm feeling really anxious right now and I could use your support.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying it as simply as that. I'm, as opposed to criticizing the other person and being fighting or just withdrawing and giving up. I obviously can't rely on everyone at all times, but trying to have the courage to do so can really deepen our relationships with others when we do so strategically, even though it's uncomfortable and anxiety provoking.
So is that when you said it can really deepen our relationships? Again, I'm just thinking of the connection paradigm, that sphere of having relationship with others and then relationship with God. I'm curious if that's...
Yeah, I think, relying on someone else isn't something that we typically value in our very independent society, but interdependence is a lot more powerful than independence. And I speak about that quite a bit in the new book, in Thriving with Anxiety, how when we recognize our real need to have relationships with others. Look at the Harvard study on adult development, like the biggest predictor of well-being and thriving, flourishing in late life is the quality of people's relationships at age 50.
Yeah.
So, we are a social species and we are really dependent on others. And I think acknowledging that, admitting it, leaning into it, being at peace with it, and then making the most of it is a better strategy than ignoring it or fighting or fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
There's another option, which is leaning into it and accepting.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just having a conversation with someone. We were talking about, it felt part of the tragedy, I think, of 2020 and COVID for many of us was that disconnection, even just the small, like asking my neighbor for, if they have a cup of sugar I can borrow. All those kinds of like little interactions ceased. And there was such a disconnection in all these small ways that maybe I didn't fully acknowledge how important those ways were, but it went really deep. I feel like when we have disconnected in all these small ways of borrowing a cup of sugar, it kind of halts or it ceases deeper connections as well. And I feel like you mentioned, in society, we're so independent, and asking someone for a cup of sugar might feel like a burden, but it just feels like so important. And I feel like it's a tragedy that
it's such a tragedy.
That. Yeah.
It's such a tragedy. And I also think that's an artifact of the modern world. And in the spiritual domains, I mean, in almost every spiritual and religious tradition, it's understood you're going to have to rely on other people. And it's not a sign of weakness or something's wrong with you. It's just part of life. In fact, you're actually stronger when you can do that because it takes guts, frankly, to develop those close relationships and say when you're in need. So that's, it's not seen as a weakness. And I think I have imputed that in some ways into my clinical work just by virtue of my, background in spiritual life.
Yeah. I appreciate you highlighting that. Like, it takes guts. It takes some courage to reach out and to forge those connections. And yeah, it's something that I hope we're understanding in the clinical realm, how important that really is.
Definitely.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the connections paradigm? I am curious about that.
Yeah. So really out of my own faith tradition, I started to, a couple of years ago, more seriously probe what does my faith tradition have to say about anxiety and depression and mental health in general, and really stumbled upon this approach, which I found to be it really filled in a gap that I thought was evident in my secular clinical training. As I mentioned before, I think we do help people to have a better relationship with themselves through resilience and through greater acceptance. Relationships with others is something that, is commonly discussed in psychotherapy, whether it's, developing our relationships. I think we could do a better job in terms of leaning into the natural discomfort of vulnerability more. But, even there's some folks in the psychotherapy world doing that kind of work, like emotionally focused therapy folks. Sue Johnson's work, I think she does a fabulous job with that. But then the last domain, I think, has just been sorely absent, which is the spiritual domain. And that was really what spoke to me and was the main emphasis for writing about and developing.
You're saying this was part of your faith tradition. From what I understand, it's like thousands of years that this was developed and kind of passed down. Is that accurate?
Yes, very much so. Teacher to student for more than 2,000 years. So it's definitely a long tradition, and one that I think is still very relevant today. But beyond the specifics of that, I think the work we've had, over 100 publications coming out of my lab here at McLean Hospital, which people can learn more about, by the way, at the website spirit.mclean.harvard.edu, which have highlighted the real clinical science that's being done. And it demonstrates that these areas of life, spirituality and mental health, are linked for many patients, for many clients, for many people in the general population for that matter. And I think that's, it's a body of research and clinical innovation that more clinicians should be aware of and able to address with their patient populations. Even just a Google Scholar search, though, these days, spirituality, religion, mental health, or more specific, spirituality and depression, spirituality and substance use, those can work. A couple of years ago, I had a project that I worked on with Dr. Harold Koenig at Duke University, the Handbook of Spirituality, Religion, and Mental Health. And it's an overpriced textbook, but it does summarize all the current research. Fairly short, but to the point, updated research-based chapters on each diagnosis. So depression, anxiety, substance abuse, issues at the end of life, eating disorders is really chock full. So it's a cool, up-to-date resource. And that was published 2022, I think, or so.
Cool. And I'm wondering, because you sent me over this Advancing Mental Health website, thinking about these three spheres. And I noticed on that website, there's the neuroscience of prayer study. I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, we had a paper recently. It wasn't an experimental paper, but we looked at the default mode network and what happens with individuals at resting state with, under MRI. And what we found is that when individuals are struggling, this is a mood disordered older adults happen to be in our sample, and individuals who were struggling with their faith had more connectivity in certain networks during resting state. And what that really indicates is that those areas of the brain, if you will, go online or offline together, which is potentially a marker of reactivity, of emotional reactivity, right? A more regulated approach would be those areas of the brain would receive blood flow in a more titrated way, as opposed to either all being on or all being off. So it kind of makes sense. Like if a person's walking around with the thought in their mind, God hates me, I'm cursed, something I did makes me spiritually sullied, feeling disconnected from spirituality, they might be more emotionally reactive. And we found this, at a neural level, which I think is pretty significant. It's one of the first studies looking at a clinical phenomena and spirituality using MRI, using fMRI, I should say.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Could you say, has there been much research of the converse? So if someone holds it the other way of like feeling connected with God and that there might be a less reactivity, or I don't know how you'd say that.
Yeah. So there's a paper a couple of years ago by some folks, I believe at Columbia. In fact, my lab recently did a review of the neuroscience of spirituality, religion, and mental health. And this is one of the standout papers in my mind of folks who are going through substance abuse treatment, and individuals who had that faith certainly were protected against certain neural indicators of craving. So, it's more nuanced when you start doing neuroimaging research and neuroscience research on spirituality and mental health. You have to be pretty specific on, who's your patient population, what are the specific measures that you're looking at, what are the brain regions, and then most of all, how are you quantifying and measuring spirituality? All of that's heterogeneous. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple ways to look at all of those different dimensions. So you have to be a lot more pointed and nuanced. But yeah, there's certainly some burgeoning, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's been slow to get this body of research off the ground. But there's certainly some indications that something's happening. And it's an area of life that we have to take as seriously as anything else.
I love that there's research being done in these fields or in this realm, because Brad Kammer, he's the director of our training center. And one thing that I've heard him mention is, and that was my experience as well in grad school, is the idea of like in a lot of our textbooks, love, heart, connection with God, like it's not discussed. It's just not brought up. And like you're naming, it's such a resource that I think has been so untapped in the field in many ways. And so the fact it's being researched, I really am just appreciative of those doing that work.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, is there anything else that you would like our listeners to know that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
I think it's important for people to have at least some CE training in spirituality and mental health and to seek that out, because usually it's not part of the graduate school curriculum. Usually it's something that people have to get afterwards. I would encourage clinicians to ask their clients about, is spirituality something that's relevant to your mental health? Is it relevant to your, whatever it is, depression, panic, relationship issues, existential crises, and to actually use this language to, spiritual and religious language, seeing if it's something that resonates with them and not shying away from it for historic reasons that frankly, I don't think have ever really applied. And, to get trained to learn how to deal with this domain, just like we do any other area of human identity. So if I have one message, it's not to shy away from this topic and to lean into it and lean into the stress that it might cause, and thereby learn how to better connect with clients and help them connect in ways that they might need in order to move to the next step in their journey.
Awesome. And if listeners are wanting to get in touch with your work, can you share with us again your website and where they might be able to find you?
Absolutely. Best way is probably through my author's website, which is dhrosmarin.com. And contact form, very happy to connect with people, point them in the direction of resources. So again, dhrosmarin.com. And reach out if anything's been of interest. And very just grateful for this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate you taking the time and for the work that you're doing and bringing to the world.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. As a mental health professional, your commitment to healing and growth inspires us. We at the Complex Trauma Training Center are committed to supporting you in your well-being and success. That's why we're honored to invite you to our Space Program 2025, an inner development program of support and self-discovery for therapists on the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal levels. Running over 6 online sessions in 2025, this interactive experiential learning program is designed to support self-care and self-discovery for therapists, exploring internally, relationally, and transpersonally. CTTC faculty will welcome you into a professional community of therapists that are seeking to create greater effectiveness and resilience in our professional lives. As CTTC faculty Brad Kammer says, the intent is that this program will help us not only become more effective therapists, but also love our work more. Please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com and secure your spot in the 2025 SPACE program. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.